Alrighty, here we go. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the interaction of aggregate demand and aggregate supply and how that works into a long-run equilibrium. Okay, we're going to be looking at several different things. The monetarist and classical approach to it. We're going to be looking at the Keynes approach to it. Let's see if the economy is equilibrium, something called a deflationary gap or recessionary gap. We're going to be looking at what they call an inflationary gap. Well, on another slide, this is how we can stay stuck in a deflationary gap. And then here's the inflationary gap. So, and then that one. So anyway, let's go ahead and get to it. This might be a little bit long, but I will try to keep it as brief as possible. Oops. Try that again. Okay. So explain using the diagram the determination of long-run equilibrium, indicating that long-run equilibrium occurs at the full employment level of output. So what we want to do is, this is the basic macroeconomic graph when it all kind of comes together. All right, so here's our price level. This is aggregate demand. And let's draw in short-run aggregate supply. All right. And then we want to find long-run aggregate supply. Its long run looks like this. All right. Now we've discussed why the long run is here, but let's just do a quick review. We know why aggregate demand is downward sloping. It's the three different things: the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign purchases effect. We know why the short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping. That's because of profit and the idea of fixed contracts, short-term fixed contracts. And the long-run aggregate supply is vertical because this just says what is basically your production capacity, and we know that we can't in the long run produce more than this amount. All right. So what we want to do, this is going to be labeled. So let me back up. Wherever short-run aggregate supply, using this model, this graph, wherever short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect, that gives us our equilibrium price level. All right. We'll just say P1. Now, also where they intersect gives us our equilibrium quantity. A couple things to look at. In the long-run aggregate supply, we use this denotation. We denote it as a YF. All right, and the F stands for full employment level of output. All right, so this is the full employment level of output. So if these two, if the short run and aggregate demand are intersecting along this long run aggregate supply curve, we would say that the economy is achieving full employment. And so what does full employment mean? Well, we'll get into a little bit greater detail later, but in the U.S., that means that there's somewhere around, give or take, 5% unemployment. All right, so we'd say that 95% of all the resources being used to their maximum, but we do have this 5% of unemployment. So again, if the short run and the aggregate demand intersect along this long run average supply curve, then we consider ourselves at full employment. All right, let's see. So that's that one. Explain why in the non-monetarist classical approach, while there may be short-term fluctuation in output, the economy will always return to the full employment level of output in the long run. All right, so this is monetarist slash new classical. Sorry about the handwriting. All right, so there's the price level, and there's the quantity. And so we'll use this graph, long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply. And whoops, let's pretend that intersects there, and aggregate demand. So let's say that, all right, here's our YF, and this is our equilibrium price level, so P1. So let's say that something happens and aggregate demand goes down. All right, so we're going to see a decrease in aggregate demand. So consumer spending goes down. Any of those things, remember, this is C plus I plus G plus NX. All right, and so if this goes down, then what's that going to do? That is going to decrease the price level, and it's going to decrease the quantity. We'll just call it Q2 because this is really Q1. And it's going to decrease the quantity. So what's going to happen to unemployment? So if our real GDP is going down, then we would expect unemployment to go up. All right, and so the monetarists would look at this and say, how is this situation going to correct itself? All right, and there's a couple of different ways that they would say that there's this self-correcting mechanism. All right, the first one is that, remember, monetarists believed in wage flexibility. All right, so if we have unemployment, that means we have a surplus of workers at the time. And so what if you're a worker and you're trying to get a job and somebody else is trying to get the same job? What could the employer do? What position does that put the employer in that he or she can now do? And so the idea here is that wages would tend to be, the pressure on wages would tend to go down because you have more unemployed resources. When that happens, remember, this is a resource cost. And so if the cost of the resources are going down, then that's going to shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the right, like that, which is going to bring us back. And so according to the way I've drawn it, it's going to bring the price level even lower, but that's going to bring the level of employment back up to the full employment level. And it's because of this belief that wages are flexible downward. All right. The other part of this is that if we have a decrease in aggregate demand and the price level starts to go down, what's going to happen to interest rates? And this is what we're talking about with the self-correcting mechanism of the economy. If interest rates go down, remember in one of the recent videos, this was the formula that we looked at. N equals I plus pi E, where the N is the nominal interest rate, the I is the real interest rate, and pi E is expected inflation. All right, and so if we see that this price level is coming down, this is another way of saying that inflation is starting to come down. And so what's that going to do to this number? It's going to pull it down. So even if this number stays the same, let's say that we were at 8% and the real rate was 3% and the inflation rate was 5%. If inflation's coming down, let's say the expected rate of inflation is now 3, then that's going to have the effect of lowering interest rates to 6% down from 8. And we know that when interest rates go down, businesses are going to invest more and definitely consumers are going to spend more, and there'll be some other effects here, but these are the two easily identified ones in the beginning. So just real quick, government spending can go up because now they can borrow more because it's cheaper to borrow. And also, when we look at net exports, if there's a decrease in the interest rate, we tend to see a weakening of the currency. And when that happens, more foreign countries want to import our stuff, so our exports would go up. And we will talk a lot more about that later. But so if interest rates go down, all of these have the potential of shooting up. And so when this happens, if we have deflation and the expected rate of inflation goes down, then you would see a decrease in the interest rate, which would help push this back up as well. All right, and so aggregate demand could come back up. So if we're in a recession, and this would be a recession, anything to the left here would be considered a recession. If we're in a recession, then two things can happen. Let me clear off just a touch of space here. Maybe. Oh, Lord. It's very sad. Maybe I won't clear off a lot of space. Two things are going to happen in a recession. Two things could happen. You could see a downward pressure on wages. And this is if the monetarists are right. And that would increase the short-run aggregate supply. And you'll probably see a decrease in the interest rates, which will lead to an increase in aggregate demand. And so now you have this curve moving back, this one moving this way, and they'll probably meet somewhere in the middle. But the idea is with the monetarists is that this process doesn't take terribly long, and so in the long run we'll always get back to this equilibrium level. All right. So we'll stop there. All right, next one, explain using the Keynesian diagram that the economy may be in equilibrium at any level of real output where AD intersects AS. All right, and so this is a little bit different model. That's our GDP real, that's the price level. Remember the Keynes aggregate supply curve looked That's a sad Keynes model. Hang on. Not one more time for the folks at home. All right, so this is our aggregate supply model. Again, this is the Keynesian range, intermediate range, and long run. And so what the Keynes model says is that, let's say aggregate demand's here. That's at 81. Does it have to go, and let me also make this point real quick. You know, this identifies what? Okay, this is saying once this goes vertical, that's saying that we've reached our max, and so we would say that that is the level of full employment. All right, but Keynes said, look, if we're below full employment, all right, if we're here, you know, here's my lord, sorry. So if we're here with our price level, and this would be the quantity, you know, we are in a recession, but Keynes says that prices and wages, wages and prices are inflexible. Okay, the other term for this, which is one of my favorite econ terms because it is not technical at all, they say that wages and prices are sticky, that they take a long time to react. And so Keynes would say that, look, there's not necessarily going to be this big downward pressure on wages right now. And so since that doesn't happen, since there is no downward pressure, there's nothing that's going to pull this back up into a long run equilibrium. So Keynes says, look, we can be in the long run there. We could be in the long run here because, again, wages and prices are inflexible downward. All right, and so we could be in the long run here. It doesn't matter where we are because since wages and prices are sticky, they don't have that self-correcting mechanism built into them that over here the monetarist thought would happen. All right, remember, wage flexibility, and so if we're in a recession here, that's going to cause wages to go down and shift the supply curve over to the right. But with the Keynesian model, that doesn't happen because the wages don't come down. All right, so that's that model. Now explain using diagram that if the economy is in equilibrium at a level of real output below the full employment level of output, then there's a deflationary gap. So let's go ahead and draw the model. So we'll do this graph. And at the end of this, I want to show you a graph that I think works the best, combines the best of both worlds. But so we'll say, nope, back that up. We'll say this is our long run aggregate supply curve. Now we got the price level. This is our full employment level of output. There's our quantity, GDP, real. All right, so if this is our equilibrium price level, and this is our equilibrium quantity, all right, anytime, let me switch pens here, anytime we're to the left of the full employment line, so anything this way is considered a deflationary or recessionary gap, all right. So they call it a deflationary gap because we're assuming we were here, all right, and then aggregate demand, so here was aggregate demand, and it shifted to the left, and so now we've had deflation, and so we talk about the deflationary gap is the distance between the current GDP and the potential or the full employment GDP. So this would be our deflationary or recessionary gap, all right. Now, the next one, discuss why in contrast to the monetarist, the economy can remain stuck in a deflationary gap in the Keynesian model. And we did this over here, so I'm not going to go through it all again, but this would be considered a deflationary gap. And again, why could it be stuck here? Why doesn't it want to work its way back to long-run equilibrium? And again, it's because of this idea of sticky wages. All right. And opposite of a deflationary gap, we have something called an inflationary gap. So you can draw this out. And if you're using this model, you can start any graph. If you're drawing inflationary gap or deflationary gap or long-run equilibrium or whatever, you can start every single model like this, okay? Because it all depends, the economy all depends on where you put the long run aggregate supply. And so if we're in an inflationary gap, we're going to put the long run to the left. So it's long run aggregate supply. That's our YF. So this is our full employment level of output. We're operating now beyond the full employment level. And so we'll tend to see inflation start to kick up. And so this distance between these two would be considered the inflationary gap. The inflationary gap. All right. Now you can measure it. Let's say that our full employment level of output is 10 trillion and our current level of output is 11 trillion. You'd say we have an inflationary gap of $1 trillion. Just like we can do the same on this other one. Let's say that the full employment here is 10 trillion and we're producing a real GDP of, say, $8 trillion. Then you would say that we have a $2 trillion deflationary gap. All right. So I think this is the last one. All right, so discuss why, in contrast with the monetarist classical model, increases in aggregate demand in the Keynesian model need not be inflationary unless the economy is operating close to or at the level of full employment. So last big graph, quantity GDP, real, price level. Here's our Keynesian aggregate supply. All right, so remember, this kind of implies this is our full employment level of output. All right, and so what if aggregate demand crosses here? All right, so here's our quantity and here's our price. So remember, it's saying why does the Keynesian model need not be inflationary? And so let's say this is aggregate demand. The government comes in and says we're going to spend a lot of money to try to get us out of this slump. So they're going to increase aggregate demand. And so what do you notice happens to the quantity? So GDP is going up. What's happening to the price level? All right, nothing is, because there's a lot of unemployed resources in this Keynesian range. And so any increase in aggregate demand is not going to put any upward pressure on prices or wages at that point. Okay, and so as we start to move closer to this long run, the vertical phase or the long run phase of the aggregate supply curve, then you start to see, that's when you start to see a little bit of inflation kick in. All right, and only when you get to up into this this long run section, that's when inflation really starts to kick in. And so if you're looking at this model as a whole, then really from here, all of this, you can have increases in aggregate demand and not have much pressure on prices. All right, only until you start to get close, when you start to get into this area, that's when prices would really start to take off. All right. Now let me make one more note, and this will only take me a couple of minutes. There are a couple of different graphs that people use when they do this. Okay, you can draw the Keynes graph. And so when you're taking your test, you can draw any of these. Any of these are perfectly acceptable if you're just doing a generic macro graph, So you could do this, real. And that would work, all right? But the limitation with this is that, is it possible to go beyond full employment? So full employment is 5%. Is it possible to have 3% unemployment in the short run? And the answer is yes, because we've had, we're down at 4. I think we even touched into the 3.9 when Clinton was president. But can you show 3% unemployment on this graph? And so it would have to be some point out here. And so if the aggregate supply here is vertical, there's no place for the aggregate demand curve to intersect it. And so this graph is not as effective. If we do this, all right, this is kind of the standard model. All right, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply, price level, Q, GDP, real. All right. Now, what happens in this model, theoretically, this is short run aggregate supply, if aggregate demand keeps going up to there, and then it goes up again, then we do see an increase in inflation, but inflation is going to increase at a lot faster pace than what this is letting us do, okay, because it just goes straight out. As you come close to the maximum, let's say that right here we're using 100% of everything. All right, according to this, you can keep going on and produce more and more and more. When we know that this is our drop dead maximum, we can't flat out produce more. And so as you get closer to the flat out max, you would start to see prices do something like this. Because if you're at 95% capacity and you want to add more, then you're going to the people that you use are going to be less efficient. There's less people available, so you might have to pay them more. And so what's going to happen is price level is going to start to rise really dramatically here. And so this model doesn't necessarily allow that. And so the one that I've kind of uh, started to use, just because in my own opinion, it seems to give us the best reality, and that is some combination of these two, because there might be some legitimacy here to this Keynesian range. There appears to be, looking at the last recession that we had, we didn't see wages fall a lot. You know, people got laid off before wages fell. But anyway, so if we draw this one, GDP real price level, and so let's draw aggregate demand. There's no debate about aggregate demand. But if we draw aggregate supply, and we have it kind of flat here, and then we start it coming up here, all right, and then it starts to crank up really fast. And then let's say that this plane, this line, is the full employment level of output. All right, and so this is saying, look, once we get up to this full employment level of output right here, if we're producing any more, prices are going to rise really fast. All right, and so we're kind of taking this section of it and this section of it, and we're going to kind of bend this up. And so this seems to be a pretty effective graph. It's showing fast inflation, because of an inflationary gap. And so if aggregate demand goes here, we say here's our inflationary gap. If aggregate demand goes here, this is our deflationary gap. So you can show all the stuff, and it seems a little bit more realistic from what I've read. Now, other economists would look at that and probably disagree completely, and they're probably a lot smarter than me. But just for our purposes, you can use any of them. But if you're more comfortable, whichever one you're more comfortable with, but this one seems to be a pretty good graph. So that's all. I'm sorry for the length of this one, but this is the macro equilibrium. So make sure that you can go through all these. One good thing to try to be able to do when you're studying for tests is to go through and look at all the headlines here. And can you do that? Can you do that? Can you do that? And go through, and that would be a way to test yourself. So anyway, until next time.